Welcome back. My name is Frank Perri, and I will be discussing the relationship of psychology to red-collar crime. In particular, we'll be looking at personality traits and whether certain types of personalities may facilitate the decision to engage in violence. I want to look at in particular in one case by the name of Aaron Hand. Aaron was a high-level executive. He appeared to be a president of some type of finance business, and he participated also in a multi-million-dollar mortgage fraud scheme. Now, while he was in custody, he also participated in a murder-for-hire scheme. He was trying to hire somebody to kill a witness who was going to disclose his fraud. Luckily, he was talking to an undercover officer. But what's really interesting is what Aaron said to the undercover officer, because he wanted to do the killing himself, but he couldn't. And he said to the undercover officer, quote, "I wish I was there to watch him suffer. Kill the wife and the children if they are home." In many respects, this goes to the heart of trying to understand red-collar crime. How is it that somebody crosses the line from being a fraud offender to a killer? Now, before I look at the psychological factors, I want to first debunk the myth of the white-collar crime character. In that at times we think that people who engage in white-collar crime do so because they don't have any other choice. Maybe they're in debt, or they have addiction problems, or they have business problems. All of those reasons may be true, but there are also other reasons that they may engage in fraud. Pure greed, that sense of entitlement. Moreover, we ought not relate crime to socioeconomic status. Often we think that a true criminal has to look like a criminal, has to come from a certain background, or that people who are educated are less likely to commit crimes. That is not the case. White-collar offenders may have non-white-collar offenses in their background. They may have other criminal histories. Moreover, let us not forget that some of the biggest atrocities in history, some of the largest crimes against humanity, were planned and committed by those who are most educated within their societies. The questions you have to ask yourself is, are they prone to exploiting opportunities at the expense of others? Now, let's look at psychological factors, and in this case, personalities. All right? I want to be clear. When we talk about personalities, we're not saying that the personality is the cause of a crime. The question is it correlated to a crime? Is it more apt that it will facilitate the decision to go down a certain path? All right? Let me give you an example, and I think that this might help clarify it for us. There are some people who engage in what I would call risky behaviors, reckless behaviors, okay? For example, some people will dive off of a cliff, not with a parachute or a glider, but nothing more than a cape, or that there are individuals who are skydivers, thousands of feet in the air. There are also other people who have a desire to go swimming with the sharks. Now, I'm not talking about being in a cage immersed in the water while the sharks are swimming around the cage. I'm talking about they actually want to go and swim with the sharks. Now, to be fair to these people, perhaps they never saw the movie Jaws, okay? Most of us got the message, all right? You don't go and swim with sharks or get in the water within their presence. But I would submit to you that even if these individuals saw the movie Jaws, some of them would actually get back in the water and swim with them. What's the point? It is who they are. This is their personality. They have a desire for thrill-seeking behaviors, all right? The next question is, well, what about if we have personality traits where a person doesn't have empathy or a person has no conscience? How does that facilitate the decision to engage in violence? All right? Let's look at one of them, malignant narcissism. On balance, narcissism is reflected by people who, for example, have a grandiose personality. may think more of themselves than they really are, may be exploitative in nature, may be attention seekers. But you also have some of those that are referred to as malignant narcissists. These are people who have an antisocial quality about them. They may be criminals at heart. They have interpersonal conflicts. What does research show? That those narcissists who are very high in exploitativeness and high in entitlement are more prone to engaging in violence. They have a desire to establish control over events that they deem discomforting to them. What might be another personality trait? Well, for example, somebody may be psychopathic. At times when we think of people who are psychopathic, we might have images in our mind that entertainers' movies represent, or we may think of serial killers like Ted Bundy, or the female serialist like Eileen Wuornos or Charles Manson, to name a few. But I want to be clear, we ought not assume that simply because somebody may be psychopathic that they're going to be killers, or that somehow violence is interchangeable with psychopathy. It is true that many people who are in our prisons who commit heinous acts are psychopathic. That's been proven. But it also means that you have some that are not. The question is psychopathy a risk factor? It is correlated to aggression. What are some of the pertinent traits of psychopathy? One of them is that lack of conscience, the inability to not have emotions, lack of empathy, pathological lying, perhaps a parasitic lifestyle, all right? That lack of guilt. For example, serial killer Ted Bundy said, "I don't feel guilty for anything. I feel sorry for people who feel guilty." But keep in mind that it's not just people who may be psychopathic and engage in violence, right? You have people who are psychopathic who are executives. They're in our military, in our religious institutions, in business, for-profit, not-for-profit. They can be our relatives and our friends. The smart ones are very good at hiding who they really are, especially those that are psychopathic, all right? What might be an example of unconscionable behavior? Let me give you an example. There was a doctor who had many patients, but he was also subjecting them to cancer treatment because he told them, well, you're going to have to get cancer treatment because you have cancer. He made millions of dollars in false medical billing. But what happened here? These individuals who were undergoing cancer treatment did not have cancer. That would be an example of that cold, callous behavior. A question that has often been raised is if a person doesn't have a conscience or displays blunted emotions, lacks empathy, is exploitative, what fills that void? Meaning most of us have emotions, have a conscience, try to do the right thing. But if we don't have those attributes, what replaces them? What observers of psychopathy have stated is that the inability to have emotions and a conscience is replaced by a desire for dominance, a desire for control and power to win, where people are used as objects to satisfy their motives and agendas. Another observer of psychopathy indicated that for psychopaths, power can be experienced only in the context of victimization. If they are to be strong, somebody else must pay. There is no such thing in the psychopath's universe as merely the weak. Whoever is weak is also a sucker. That is someone who demands to be exploited. At times, we can also listen to how psychopaths speak so that we can get and put aside academic terminologies and just listen to what they say and the words that they use. That reveals their psychopathy because the words lack emotion. They lack emotional value. Let me give you an example. A violent rapist was asked, well, how do you feel about what you've done? And he said in a laughing manner, well, how do you feel the last time you squashed a bug? Another homicidal offender had indicated that when he was asked, well, do you have any remorse for the crimes that you've done? And his answer was, remorse? What for? I didn't even know the victims. Just from these two examples, you can just sense that there's a disconnect in their words, that it lacks value on an emotional scale. Another psychopathic offender was asked, well, what impact did you have on your victims? And his answer was, quote, well, maybe I did hurt them, but how do you expect that to change things for me? What other people feel is not important to me. We also can get a sense from a female serial killer when she was asked about her crimes. And in this case, she was an individual that killed what I would characterize as more elderly people. And basically she said, well, most of the people I killed were gonna die anyways, either from old age or from some disease. But children? I never killed children. I love children. Another perfect example where you can sense the emotional disconnect, and that sometimes what people say speaks volumes about their personalities. Let me just summarize some of the potential personality risk factors that might facilitate violence as a solution, especially when we're looking at those individuals who are antisocial, who may display malignant narcissism, and who may be psychopathic. In that the literature, and the academic literature to be specific, shows that they see violence as a solution to a perceived problem, that those individuals who are highly entitled and highly exploitative are willing to engage in violence, that they also are into preemptive strikes against the innocent people. What does that mean? That somebody who may not even know that they may be a problem could end up dead. And it's also correlated their personalities to unprovoked aggression. As you can see from this segment, people do have different personalities, but what we need to understand is that different personalities carry with it different risk factors. And unfortunately, certain risk factors can facilitate the decision to engage in violence. I want to thank you for listening to this segment. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and stay tuned for our question and answer segment.
Frank, how do psychopaths recognize emotions in others?
You know, I once had a student of mine ask me that question, and I had to do my own research on that because it's a beautiful question. Why? Because if they themselves lack emotions, how is it that they're capable of recognizing in others something that they themselves lack? Well, what they do is, and this is from research, is that they study other people. What do I mean by that? They look at associations between behaviors and reaction. So, for example, if they see something that looks like we would recognize them as sad, then they'll make those associations between, okay, that person is behaving in a certain way and must mean that there's something wrong that's not right with them, all right? So they make those associations, and that's what the smart psychopaths do. One psychopathic offender who was homicidal, he actually, in fact, I believe he was a white-collar offender also, he would read psychology books to try to understand how people should behave. Now, in terms of the emotions, and your question, it triggered a quote where one psychopathic offender said that he imagined that he felt emotions, but he could not, and that he struggled with it, but he simply couldn't feel those emotions. So when people, that's why at times when they do express emotions, or at least it looks like they're expressing emotions, it's more ritualistic. It's more of, how do I convey something that is convincing to another? For example, if something terrible happens, how do I show remorse? How do I show sadness or regret? They have to study that, and that's what the smart psychopaths do.
Why do psychopaths continuously engage in criminal and antisocial behaviors?
First of all, many psychopaths do engage in criminal behaviors and they are in our prisons. Okay. The question becomes, why is that? In part, I think the answer is what these observers of psychopathy said. And it was, in my opinion, a wonderful characterization. And they said that psychopaths at times are, quote, prisoners of the present. What does that mean? And that is that they cannot necessarily reflect upon the past and say, what did I do wrong? And then change their behaviors. But they also have problems in reflecting into the future and asking themselves, how does my behavior play itself out? In that they're not only necessarily harming other people, for example, but they are also harming themselves. So that characterization that they are prisoners of the present is a gorgeous characterization. They keep, in a sense, repeating that same mistake over and over again because they're stuck.
So we're talking a lot about psychopaths in the context of criminality. Are there psychopaths that are able to live crimeless, normal lives?
I would have to share this much in terms of the normality of psychopathy. And that is that there was a book that was written many years ago, and his name was Hervey Cleckley, and he's, in many respects, were considered the father of modern-day psychopathy. And it was called The Mask of Sanity. And what he was saying is that they may give the appearance of normalcy on the outside, but behind the mask, you're not necessarily dealing with an individual that may have the human qualities that we're used to, all right? And what do I mean by that? Well, if you are somebody that has a conscience, somebody that has empathy, you behave a certain way, but they don't. In many respects, they are referred to almost having a chameleon-like quality where they blend in with society enough to get by, meaning they know what they are, but the smart ones try to hide it from other people. Many of them don't have a criminal history, but it doesn't mean that you have to have a criminal history to be antisocial. What do I mean? You may have management, high-level executives who are psychopathic. And what do? They don't necessarily commit crimes, but they'll bully people, they'll intimidate people, they'll engage in what I refer to as public humiliation. Why is that? Because they're trying to control the person and the environment around them to say, listen, I'm in control here, don't get in the way of my agenda.
Frank, can psychopathy be measured, and what can you share with us about that?
The concept of psychopathy on a clinical level can be measured, and there are assessments that actually can clinically measure psychopathy. Now, there is one assessment, and it measures it from a scale of 0 to 40. And there are many different questions that are asked that pertain to different types of traits. Now, not to go into all of the traits, typically when we look at individuals who score high, meaning 25 and above, okay, it's on a continuum, then we are looking at somebody who really has those core traits of psychopathy. Now, there was a serial killer. Her name was Eileen Wuornos, all right? And in fact, there was a movie made of her. It was called Monster. She had a score of 32. That is, on the psychopathy scale, very high. Now, there was also an alternative study done in a business environment in order to measure psychopathy with executives. And these were people who were well-educated, had medical degrees, PhDs, they were lawyers, well-educated people. What did they find? They found that 2 individuals had a score of 33 out of 40, and one of them had a score of 34. 3 individuals, 3 white-collar workers, had a greater psychopathy score than a serial killer. Why does that matter? Getting back to the original point that I made, you have people who are psychopathic in all avenues of life. They are in our families, they're in our business environments, they're in religious organizations, in the military, for profit, not for profit. And we may not even know that they're in fact psychopathic because they may be very good at hiding their traits. That's why they may have that chameleon quality about them. But rest assured that everybody makes mistakes and that at times their traits trickle out at different times, all right? And that's where you have to train yourself to try to recognize those traits.
How do behavioral profiles impact investigations?
Understanding the offender is important in understanding the crime, in part. Let me explain. Many red-collar offensive have horrific crime scenes. They're horrific. Sometimes there is a misinterpretation of the crime scene, and what do I mean? We sometimes equate the horrific nature of the crime scene with some type of emotional outburst, that it was one of anger and resentment, and that simply is not the case. That simply is not the case, especially when we're looking at individuals who may be malignant narcissists or psychopathic. Why? Because they may be planning the elimination of a person for weeks or months. The fact that it looked horrific is not necessarily a display of an emotional outburst. Why is that important, you ask? Well, if you then start to interview a potential suspect, that can impact on how you start questioning the person. So for example, if you start thinking, well, you killed your parents, were you angry at them? Were you mad at them? Those issues may not have anything to do with it. The parents were in the way of what that person wanted. They needed to be eliminated. And what's interesting is also, especially when we look at cases that involve the family, you'll see actually the mother who will be killed because she's simply a potential witness to the crime. You know, sorry, mom, you should have gone on a trip, but you're here, you're going to have to be eliminated. I'm going to have to take you out. So how we look at a crime scene can impact the questions we ask a potential suspect, and it may have nothing to do with emotions.
Where can someone go to get more information on red-collar offenders and white-collar crime in general?
You know, I spent many years studying white-collar crime in general, organizational misconduct, and also red-collar crime. And my goal was to try to put together a book that was holistic in nature. One that can explain both at the individual level what were some of the risk factors that somebody would engage in white-collar crime and red-collar crime, but also some of the questions that many of us face who work in organizations. And I wrote a book on white-collar crime, organizational misconduct, and fraud examination, where I look at the criminological reasons, the behavioral reasons, and also some of the accounting reasons behind white-collar crime. So if an individual has any interest on top of red-collar crime, but white-collar crime in general, they can always use that as a wonderful reference.
Thanks, Frank.